Welcome to the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies Online. For more information about our programs, publications and membership, please visit our website, themuslimfaculty.org.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Muslim History program of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies. This is the 7th of 12 sessions which make up the second module, the Madhhabs of Islam. The lecture will last approximately 40 minutes, during which time you should make a written note of any questions that may occur to you for clarification after the lecture. Today's topic concerns the last of the four madhabs that have remained until our own time, that of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. It was the last of the four madhabs to develop, but their developments were, of course, closely related to each other. Imam Ahmad was a direct student of Imam Shafi'i, who in turn was a direct student of both Imam Malik and Muhammad ibn al-Hassan al-Shaybani, one of the main transmitters of the fiqh of Abu Hanifa. There were, however, marked differences between Ahmad and the other Imams, some of which we will look at during this lecture. For most of its history, the Hanbali madhab has been one of the smallest of the four madhabs in terms of followers, but its significance for the intellectual as well as the political history of Islam should not be underestimated. Before entering the arena of politics, however, our first point of departure is the early life of the Imam and the education that shaped his later career. Introducing Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley writes, he was born in Baghdad in Rabi al-Awwal, 164 after Hijrah, half a generation after Imam al-Shafi'i, making him, historically speaking, the last of the four Imams. This fact, and the fact that he was born in Baghdad, have a considerable bearing on the course of his life and the studies he was to take. By the time Imam Ahmad came into the world and was brought up in Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate was thoroughly established, and Baghdad became a truly cosmopolitan imperial capital, a world away from the Medinan environment in which Islam had originally been established. By Imam Ahmad's time, Persian elements had come to dominate Arab elements, and the sophistication of Persian civilization was in the ascendance in general throughout the Muslim world. The cities of Islam were inundated with differing nations and races, and the texts of all kinds were being translated from Persian, Syriac, Greek, Latin, and other languages into Arabic. The result of this was that the more or less homogeneous cultural environment of early Islam had become fragmented as all these different influences became a part and parcel of the Muslim world. Add to this the clash of earlier religious traditions, together with the attempts of their adherents to mold Islam towards their own worldviews, and the result was an ambience, both religious and physical, which would have been all but unrecognizable to the first generations of Muslims. And Shaykh Abdul Haq continues in another passage, this was what confronted Ahmad ibn Hanbal, as he grew up in the Abbasid capital, and as a pure-hearted, intelligent, and deeply pious youth, he was left with the quandary of how, in the light of all the sophisticated deviation he was facing, how he could remain something of the light, how he could regain something of the light, clarity, and simplicity of the formative early days of Islam. The way he went about achieving his aim has already been indicated in the quotation from At-Tabari. He became a muhaddith. In order to get as complete as a detailed picture as possible of the life of the first community, he devoted himself to accumulating the maximum possible number of reports from that time, not only from the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but also from the companions, may Allah be pleased with all of them. So from very early in his life, Imam Ahmad chose the men of hadith and their method, and dedicated himself to it. to the extent that it certainly appeared that he had taken the path of the hadith scholars rather than those who combined fiqh with hadith, as Imam Malik, for example. In his search for hadith, Imam Ahmad traveled widely through the heartlands of Islam and may have been the first muhaddith to collect the hadith of every region of the Muslim world and record them. Another thing which marked him out was his use of the pen in compilation of hadith. In spite of his well-known prodigious memory, Imam Ahmad wrote down the hadith he collected. The end result of all this hadith recording, which started when he was 16 years old and continued through much of his life, was his great Musnad, which contains almost 30,000 hadith. Before further examining the political, social, and scholarly context in which Ahmad lived, we will mention some of the teachers and students that were in his circles. He began seeking knowledge in the year 179 after Hijrah, when he was 15 years old, and that's the same year as Imam Malik passed away. Some of the teachers included, as we mentioned previously, Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, Abd al-Razzaq, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Abu Nu'aym, and many other leading scholars of his time. And regarding the discussion as to whether Imam Ahmad was a man of hadith as well as a man of fiqh, we can at least note that he studied with the greatest scholars of his time in both disciplines. Among the ones he took hadith from were Qutayba ibn Sa'id, Ali ibn Madini, Abu Bakr ibn Abi Shayba, Harun ibn Ma'ruf, and other contemporaries. The number of men he narrated from in his great hadith compilation, the Musnad, amounts to around 280. And naturally, Imam Ahmad had numerous students, and his reputation, particularly as a master of hadith, soon became widespread. Those who narrated hadith from him are also among the most famous, including Al-Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, An-Nasa'i, and At-Tirmidhi. We might also add that Ibn Majah narrated from a man who in his turn narrated directly from Imam Ahmad. Moreover, his teachers Abd al-Razzaq, Al-Hasan ibn Musa al-Ashyab, and Abu Abdullah al-Shafi'i all narrated from him. Imam Ahmad became known for his scrupulousness regarding hadith, which his Musnad makes clear. It's narrated by his son, Abdullah, from Abu Zur'ah, that Imam Ahmad memorized 1 million hadith, and according to Al-Dhahabi, it represents an accurate record of his vast capacity for memorization. And regarding his trustworthiness, it's narrated that Imam al-Shafi'i said to him, Abu Abdullah, if the hadith is sahih with you, tell us so we can refer to it. You are most knowledgeable about sahih reports. So tell me so I can go with it, whether it's from Kufa, Syria, or Basra. It was, however, not only the great mastery of hadith that he was famous for. He was also a scholar of fiqh. As Ibn Wara said, Ahmad was a man of fiqh, memorization, and knowledge. Likewise, Imam Nasa'i said, Imam Ahmad gathered knowledge of hadith, fiqh, scrupulousness, taqwa, zuhud, and sabr. But nevertheless, it's the focus on hadith that both Imam Ahmad and his followers became known for. Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley writes regarding the difference between Imam Ahmad and the other Imams. The 3 earlier Imams all definitely represented a particular methodology. Imam Abu Hanifa, the Iraqi school of opinion of Ra'i, Imam Malik, the Medina school of direct transmission, and Imam al-Shafi'i, his own system based on textual analysis. Imam Ahmad, on the other hand, cannot be said to have devised a particular methodology of fiqh. The great historian of Islam, At-Tabari, for instance, did not even include the Madhhab of Imam Ahmad when discussing the early fuqaha. He said of him, he was a man of hadith, not a man of fiqh. And for this, the followers of Imam Ahmad almost followed or went after At-Tabari and it became a great controversy in Baghdad because of this. Qadi Iyad states in his book Tartib al-Madarik, he was less than an imam in fiqh, although he was brilliant in investigation of his sources. And there were many other great ulama who did not consider him the founder of a school of fiqh. Indeed, he only became an imam of fiqh after his death, and that was because of his students collected together his statements, fatwas, and opinions, forming a legal corpus which was posthumously ascribed to him. And Abu Bakr al-Khalal is the most famous of his followers that recorded his fiqh. Sometimes the transmission from him varied considerably, and sometimes they agreed. Sheikh Abdul-Haq further states, all in all, then it must be said that from very early times there has been much discussion about whether Imam Ahmad can really be said to have been the founder of a separate madhab. It's certainly clear that he was in a different category than the other three, who all represented very specific methodologies in their implementation of the book and the sunnah. He was definitely one of a kind in terms of the time and place where he lived, and plowed his own furrow in his determination to cleave as closely as he possibly could to the path followed by the first community in Medina, remaining absolutely orthodox in his views, while at the same time being somewhat at odds with the prevailing ethos surrounding him. This is significant in the light of some of those who were to adopt him as their imam in fiqh later on, several of whom were people who found themselves at odds with the authorities of their own time, and found in Imam Ahmad a way of remaining firmly within the bounds of orthodox Muslim belief and practice, while at the same time differentiating themselves from the power structures of the time. In order to understand the scholarship of Imam Ahmad and the madhab that developed in his name, it is important to look at the political and social context in which he lived and worked. Before discussing his legal methodology and scholarly considerations, we will therefore look at the great changes that occurred in the Abbasid society during the 2nd and 3rd century after Hijrah. His historical role and importance for the preservation of orthodoxy at this crucial point might be indicated by the words of Al-Muzani, who said, "In the day of the Mihna, the Abbasid Inquisition, there was Ahmad ibn Hanbal. In the day of Ridda, there was Abu Bakr. In the day of Saqifa, there was Omar. And in the day of the house, that is the besiegement of Sayyidina Uthman's house, there was Uthman. And in the day of the camel and Siffin, there was Ali." Imam Ahmad lived during one of the most flourishing epochs of political power, civilization, and culture. He lived under 8 Abbasid caliphs, from Al-Mahdi to Al-Mutawakkil. He witnessed the peak of the Abbasid Caliphate, its cultural achievements, and the last period of strong caliphal power until the Osmanlis revived it some centuries later. It was, however, far from a peaceful and uncomplicated era. Real political authority began to transfer into the hands of Persian governors and local rulers, even if the power appeared to remain among the caliphs. Sometimes the growing threat of the Persian and Turkish powers, as well as from scholars and so on, but these Turkish and Persian powers had initially helped the Abbasid dynasty to overthrow the Umayyads, and because of the growing threat of them, the Caliph started to order executions. Thus Al-Mansur ordered the execution of Abu Muslim al-Khurasani. Harun al-Rashid ordered the execution of al-Baramika, among many others, and Al-Ma'mun ordered Al-Fadl ibn Sahl to be killed. It was a time of numerous Shia rebellions against the Abbasid Caliphate, particularly in the time of Harun al-Rashid and al-Mutawakkil. And no regions were spared from fitna, fighting and rebellion. But the regions of Persia and Iraq were the most exposed to Shia uprisings. It was also the time of the beginning of the Ismaili movement and the spread of their propaganda, which later led to the establishment of the Fatimid dynasty in North Africa. As we examined in the course on the history of the Khalifas, social life in the Abbasid period was shaped by the mixing of people from a wide variety of origins and cultures. In fact, at the beginning of the Abbasid Caliphate, only around 5% of the population are said to have been Muslims, which comes from a study of, I think his name is Richard Bullion, American scholar, expert on Persian history and the Abbasid Caliphate and so on. I think the book is called On the Edge. I think that's the title. And then the other 95% belong to other religions and cultures, but living under Muslim rule. It was a period of economic prosperity, which can be seen in the remnants of the great architecture of the cities that were established and the palaces that the caliphs built for their courts. The life of wealth and luxury was mainly confined to the upper classes in the society, which include, for instance, senior statesmen, traders, and manufacturers. Therefore, the vast majority of the population belonged to the middle or lower classes. And because of the many lifestyles, ideas, and cultures, order in the Abbasid cities were constantly challenged by the different religious and scientific movements promoting different beliefs and practices. In the midst of the political events and great social changes, the fuqaha established their own authority and standing within the caliphate, which made them influential, but also targets for authoritarian rulers. In fact, Imam Ahmad came from a family of political engagement. His grandfather had fought for the establishment of the Abbasid Dawla, and his father had been an officer in the Abbasid military. Imam Ahmad dedicated his life to scholarship, but never ceased to call the men in power to uphold the beliefs and practices of the people of the Sunnah. Although he often disagreed with the political conduct of the caliphate, he did not call people to rise against the caliphs, holding that such uprisings would oppose the laws of the Sharia and lead to further civil strife. He is known to have deliberately withdrawn from political affairs. He refused to accept gifts from the rulers, and he distanced himself from politics. Thus he avoided cultivating relationships with the leaders, but he never arose against them, nor encouraged such rebellions. As we know from the Mihna, from the time of Al-Ma'mun onwards, where the Mu'tazila doctrines were imposed upon people, particularly the leading ulama of the time. And during this time, Imam Ahmad was tortured for holding on to the original creed of the Muslims, and he stood firm against any deviating doctrines enforced by those in command of the Muslims. Famously, he refused to accept the Mu'tazila doctrine of the createdness of the Quran. And Muhammad Abu Zahra writes, 4 caliphs tried him in various ways, but he emerged from all these trials a righteous man. Al-Ma'mun tested him through injury. He was brought to him, shackled in heavy iron chains and subjected to great hardship. Al-Ma'mun tested him with imprisonment and flogging. Al-Wathiq tested him with a ban and constriction. They did not deflect him from his convictions. Then, after those afflictions, he was tested by a different sort of trial. Al-Mutawakkil sent him good things, but he rejected them. This was then after the mihna had ended. Making himself go hungry and not taking anything whose lawfulness was uncertain. He was scrupulous about that. As we know, the scholars were the most severely tested by the mihna, and Imam Ahmad was one of the few who remained firm against it, becoming, as it were, a symbol for steadfastness and holding to the truth in face of oppressive leadership. And then we're going to look at some of the development in scholarship during this period. The early Abbasid period is known as the golden age of science and culture in the history of Islam. Caliphs encouraged scientific developments and granted patronage to scholars, trying to keep them as close to themselves by honoring as well as threatening them. By involvement in science and adab, encompassing a variety of literary disciplines, people of knowledge qualified for high positions in society, and scholarship thus became closely linked to politics. It was also a time of great translation projects, which we mentioned before. Books from a number of different languages and scientific traditions were made available in Arabic. The most important were the Persian and Greek traditions. Works of ancient Greek philosophy, in particular, were translated and made their way into Muslim societies under caliphal supervision, most famously under Ma'mun, who had this great translation project alongside the Mihna. The Beit al-Hikmah was established in Baghdad, and it became a center for scientific development. The caliphal capital, in which Imam Ahmad was active, witnessed intense debates and great disagreements among the various scientific movements. Most importantly, the Mu'tazila brought the rationalist and philosophical approach to science into the Arabic intellectual discourse, which stirred up great debates. And that affected all men of knowledge, regardless of their philosophical stance. It is within this context that we understand the scholarship of Imam Ahmad and his followers, many of whom became known for their defense against the deviating beliefs that spread among the rationalist theologians of Kalam. After Imam Shafi'i had laid down the rules for deriving legal judgments from the Quran and the Sunnah, Imam Ahmad began to lay down the rules for the science of Hadith. His scholarship, as manifested by his Musnad, made him widely recognized as a leading scholar of Hadith. His works became a milestone in the development towards Hadith as a specialized and clearly defined science, distinct from the science of fiqh. As Sheikh Abdul-Haq writes about his Musnad, for Imam Ahmad, the Musnad was like a great painting in which the myriad reports it contain were the individual brush strokes which together made up the most accurate portrayal he could possibly convey of what the Deen of Islam had been like in its original pristine condition. It was this picture, made up of sayings of the prophets and reports and decisions from the companions, may Allah be pleased with all of them, which was the bedrock on which Imam Ahmad built his life and on which he based all his judgments. When characterizing the fiqh of Imam Ahmad, Abu Zahra writes, "When we study Hanbali fiqh, we find a mature, strong, living fiqh in which two elements can be seen, both of which were strengthened and their scope extended in the area of behavior more than other areas of fiqh, that was tradition and latitude. Imam Ahmad's fiqh is one in which tradition is manifested in its strongest and clearest form. He preferred the opinions of the companions, and when there were two opinions among the companions, he chose between them. Sometimes he opted for one, but sometimes he had two opinions on the same questions. When he did not consider that he had the right to choose between the opinion of those noble people without a justifying text, since that would involve contradicting one of them. When there was no text or tradition on a matter from the companions, he exercised ijtihad. In the area of social transactions, mu'amalat, when there was no text or tradition or possible analogy, he let the matter rest on its basic permissibility. That is why in the field of contracts and preconditions, his is the Islamic fiqh with the widest and most extensive scope, because it considers contracts and preconditions to be basically sound unless there is clear evidence that they are invalid. No evidence of validity is necessary. Evidence is only required to demonstrate invalidity. As a master of hadith, his legal thinking was, similarly to Imam Shafi'i, largely based on texts. Sheikh Abdul Haq continues, in as far as he had a methodology for deriving judgments from these sources, he depended upon Imam Shafi'i, under whom he had studied and who was one of his most revered teachers. When he met Imam Shafi'i, he learned the rules for sound understanding of the book and reports of the Sunnah, comparison of textual sources, knowledge of the abrogating and the abrogated, and in general how to deduce secondary rulings from the basic sources of the Sharia. So in this respect, he was certainly not the same as the other three Imams, each of whom had their own very distinct methodology for deriving judgments in the deen. Thus, when we return to the question of Imam Ahmad as a scholar of hadith or fiqh, Abu Zahra writes, Imam Ahmad was the faqih who was dominated by righteousness to the point that his very righteousness prevented him from following through his fiqh to the furthest extent. He hesitated when others went ahead and wavered when others resolved. He paused over the meaning when others spoke. He was silent about fatwas when others rushed to give them. That is why his inclination to hadith predominated over his fiqh, leading some scholars to reckon him as a hadith scholar rather than a faqih, as we mentioned at-Tabari previously. He continues, the view of those who deny that Ahmad was a faqih is supported by the fact that no book on fiqh is reported from him, whereas the Musnad is. During his time, a great deal was written about fiqh. Muhammad al-Shaybani collected the fiqh of Iraq, Abu Yusuf wrote books on fiqh, and Shafi'i dictated or wrote down his school. Ahmad, on the other hand, as historians agree, did not do so at all. That shows that he was a muhaddith, not a faqih, in the opinion of Abu Zahra, or at least that hadith dominated his fiqh. There is no doubt that some hadith scholars held opinions regarding matters of fiqh. Al-Bukhari falls into that category, as does Imam Muslim. That does not charge them from being hadith scholars to being fuqaha. That does not change them from being hadith scholars to being fuqaha. If someone is absorbed in the study of hadith, and specializes in it, he's a muhaddith. If someone gives many fatwas and is absorbed in it, he is a faqih. We do not find anyone who combines them both equally except Imam Malik ibn Anas, who was unique in that respect. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was a faqih as well as a hadith scholar, even though we admit that his inclination to hadith was stronger. He did not leave any writings on fiqh, but left the great musnad on hadiths. He became an imam in fiqh after his death, and that was because his students collected together his statements, fatwas, opinions, and forming a legal collection which was ascribed to him. Sometimes the transmission from him varied, as we mentioned previously, and sometimes they agreed. That was also the view of Ibn al-Qayyim, the great later Hanbali scholar, who states in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, the reason why Imam Ahmad did not write a book was that he strongly disliked writing books on any other subject than hadith. But Allah knows best what his intention was. It was his students who concerned themselves with recording his books and fatwa, his fatwas. Regardless of how Imam Ahmad viewed himself, his scholarship laid the foundation for what became a clearly defined madhhab among his followers. So regardless of what he thought himself, he certainly became a madhhab and has remained as such until our time. When reflecting on the reasons for why Imam Ahmad became the founder of a madhhab and what made his followers form a legal guild based on his legacy, Shaykh al-Haq writes, another reason perhaps why Imam Ahmad was made the founder of a new school of fiqh was because of his absolutely exemplary character, which inspired many people to take him as a model during his own lifetime. There is no doubt that all four Imams were impeccable in their personal behavior, and that all of them had superlative qualities of character that marked them out among their contemporaries. Imam Ahmad, however, had a reputation for saintliness which outshone all of them. From his earliest youth, he was famous for his incorruptible integrity, which was put to a severe test later in his life when he, unlike almost all his contemporaries, suffered over 2 years of imprisonment and constant severe beatings rather than adopt the rationalist Mu'tazila doctrine of the creationness of the Quran, which had become official Abbasid governmental policy and which was clearly contrary to the position held by the early Muslims. This event also showed his steadfastness and patience, which saw him through the many other difficult periods which punctuated his long life. Other qualities he possessed were great generosity in spite of scant means, transparent sincerity, scrupulousness and abstinence, modesty and cheerfulness, and a natural authority which ensured that people paid attention to what he said. He had enormous circles around him in Baghdad, as we know. So strong was his connection with the early days of Islam, and so brightly was the light that time reflected in all he said and did, that some of his contemporaries described him as being a great follower removed from his proper time. All these things and his status as a man of knowledge meant that when he died on the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal in 241 after Hijrah, more than 300,000 people joined his funeral procession. Ibn al-Qayyim also writes, Abu Bakr al-Khalal collected Imam Ahmad's text in the Great Collection, Al-Jami' al-Kabir, which comprised 20 or more volumes. His fatwas and questions were related, and people reported them from generation after generation. He became an Imam and a model for the people of the Sunnah in subsequent generations, to the point that even those who opposed his schools by ijtihad and imitated others esteemed his texts and fatwas. They gave them their due and acknowledged their closeness to the texts and fatwas of the companions, which he largely relied upon. Anyone who considers his fatwas and those of the companions will see a correspondence between them. All can see that it seems as if they came from the same niche. And after the death of Imam Ahmad, many great scholars followed in his footsteps. Among the most famous ones were Abu Bakr al-Khalal, as we mentioned, the one who gathered the fiqh of Imam Ahmad, Ibn Aqil, who's a later scholar from the 5th century, Abdul Qadir al-Jailani from the 6th century after Hijrah, Abu al-Faraj Ibn al-Jawzi from the same century. We have Ibn Qudama, and then we have Ibn Taymiyyah from the 8th century. He died in 728 after Hijrah. We have Ibn al-Qayyim and Ibn Rajab, who is also from around 50 to 100 years after Ibn Taymiyyah. In the modern age, reform movements of the 7th century onwards began to refer to the Hanbali legacy in their political and theological positions, although their views were quite removed from the traditional form of the Madhhab. We have, for example, the Qarizadili movement in the Osmanli territories, in Istanbul and so on, and then the followers of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, which also began as a Hanbali movement, inspired by that. This later development and its impact on the Muslim community down to our time will be examined in the 2 last lectures of this course, dedicated to the modern reform movements, beginning from around the 17th century and then focusing on the 18th and 19th centuries up until a long time. Before summarizing his significance, it's fitting that we conclude with the words of Imam Ahmad himself, who said, "A man should not set himself up to give independent judgments about the deen unless he possesses 5 qualities. He must have a clear intention, because unless he has, he will have no light. He must have knowledge, forbearance, gravity, and tranquility. He must be firm in his knowledge. He must be independent and not dependent on other people, and he must be known to people." And finally, Sheikh Abdul Haq summarizes his importance as follows. There are few people in the history of Islam who have fulfilled these criteria to the extent that Imam Ahmad himself did. So what can certainly be said is that Imam Ahmad was a mujtahid of the very highest rank, absolutely able to make independent judgments concerning matters of the deen. That does not in itself, however, automatically make him the founder of an independent school of fiqh, and if he was, it was certainly in a very different way to that of his 3 preeminent predecessors. So this goes back to the discussion about if he was a man of fiqh or hadith, but it certainly developed into a school of fiqh afterwards, so we can certainly call him a founder of a madhhab. And that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Next week's lecture is entitled Origins of the School of Aqidah and will be delivered by Sheikh Ali Laraki. Recommended reading in relation to this lecture is the chapter on Imam Ahmad in Abu Zahra's The 4 Imams, and then of course Sheikh Abdul Haq's book as well, So the title is The Four Madhabs of Islam. And for the upcoming lecture, we recommend you to have a look at the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology, which contains many useful articles about the early development of the sciences of Aqidah, and also the whole political and social context around that. I would also recommend Sheikh Nuh Keller's article, Kalam in Islam, which talks about these questions in relation to the contemporary times. And that one is also available online. So thank you for your attention. Assalamu alaikum.